When the Apostle Paul first arrived in the city of Athens, according to the book of Acts, he was just kind of killing time. He was waiting for his friends to catch up with him, and so he did what you do in a place like Athens. He started behaving like a tourist. There was a lot to visit in Athens. The city had once been the center of a great empire. Upon its Acropolis were some of the most celebrated buildings and temples in the entire world, and that was just the beginning, for it was a city of temples. And there were also the theaters where not only the greatest plays had ever in the history of the world had been staged, but stages upon which the thespian art itself had been invented. And of course there was the Agora, the legendary marketplace to the north of the Acropolis. There, among those streets of the Agora, the very idea of democracy, this idea of a rule of people by the people, had been born. And there among the stalls and shops, thinkers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle had walked and talked and argued. But here was the thing. When Paul arrived in the city, that was all ancient history. It had been about 400 years since Athens had been the center of anything. But here's a tip for you. You'd better not tell the Athenians that, because as far as the Athenians were concerned, they were still the greatest people upon the face of the earth, and they judged everyone else accordingly. And so when Paul had finished visiting the various tourist sites around Athens, once he'd taken all of his snapshots and sent out his postcards or whatever tourists did back then, he started talking to the people. Talking in the legendary Agora of Athens about the gods and the ideas they had. And he spoke in ways that seemed to challenge the notion that they knew everything. And the Athenians, they were not impressed. They called Paul, according to the book of Acts, a babbler. At least that's how it's translated in the NRSV. What they literally called him was a scavenger, a seed picker, and a gossiper. And they hauled him off to court to be judged. The court they took him to was called the Areopagus. And the Areopagus had once been a real happening place. Like 500 years ago, the men of the Areopagus had ruled Athens as elder statesmen. But it was no longer the institution it had once been. It was, however, still a court, sort of. A court where they discussed violations of religious protocol. And I know that doesn't sound too powerful, and it really wasn't. But I'm sure that some of the Areopagites thought that their inquest was really important. They were there to judge this babbler, this seed picker, and they looked down their noses at him and waited for him to embarrass himself. You know, it's kind of an extraordinary moment in history. The dying embers of what was once the greatest civilization on earth facing down the rising star of this crude new thing called Christianity. It's even more extraordinary when you realize that this is just the kind of moment we are living in right now. Because I feel like I and others, we've been walking around the marketplace of Athens lately. Except, of course, we're not really allowed to walk around the marketplace these days. We have to engage it from the safety of our own homes. But we've been looking around at our world, and many of us have seen that the world lately and how things have been happening has led us to call into question a lot of the assumptions about the world and how it works and what to do about it. To put it bluntly, this pandemic crisis has shown up many of the cracks and weak points within our society. We have been shown, and shown clearly, the flaws and the problems, for example, in our long-term care system. I think we've seen pretty clearly how short-sighted it was to allow such concentration of wealth into the hands of a tiny portion of the population. And we have certainly seen how foolish it was to look down upon and disdain low-wage workers who provided for us the basic needs of life. These are but a few examples, but when you put all of this stuff together, I think it's led many of us to think that maybe this society and the way it functioned was not quite as successful and secure as we all once believed that it was. Maybe it was not strong at all. Maybe it was all just an illusion. I think that's what Paul saw in Athens. He saw all of the cracks and the shortcomings of Athenian society. And when he was put on the spot, and when he was placed before the Areopagus and he was expected to react to the apparent impressiveness of the place by folding up and bowing to the Athenian greatness, Paul didn't do that. Paul stood up and he called those people out for what they were. Athenians, he said, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. And yes, they took that for flattery. They puffed up their chests and thought of all their fine religious traditions. But you see, Paul had noticed a certain hollowness to their religious beliefs. He had seen that when he found an altar dedicated to an unknown God in the city. This seems to indicate that they, yes, honored their religious traditions, the traditions of their ancestors, but there was a sense in which their religion was just a question of covering all their bases and pleasing all the powers. Their religion was just going through the motions. There was no depth to it. And so Paul began to introduce them to the God that he knew, the God that he had come to know through Jesus, the God who made the world and everything in it, who is the Lord of heaven and earth. And as he spoke to them about this God, he said something that I fear we actually often miss in this passage, but that posed a very important challenge to the people of Athens. Paul says this, from one ancestor God made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live. Now, what Paul is talking about here is an aspect of the rule of God in this world that we don't often think about. He's describing a notion that God rules over the peoples and the nations of this world in a very particular way. This is an idea that is highlighted many times in the Bible, maybe especially in the book of Daniel. But we don't talk about it very much because it's really not a very comfortable idea. You see, the ancient people of Israel watched from their unique observation post in the middle of the ancient Near East as empires and the great cultures that surrounded them rose and fell. They saw the rise and fall of Egypt, of Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. They saw Alexander the Great and the Greeks rise and fall, and the rise of the Roman civilization. And they noticed something. Every empire, every civilization thought that they were the final word, that they would last forever. And every single one of them was wrong. Empires, no matter how powerful, came to an end sooner or later. Civilizations, no matter how civilized, never lasted. And so the prophets of Israel came up with this very controversial idea that all of this was actually part of God's plan. that God was the one who set limitations and boundaries upon the great empires and civilizations of the earth. And so what was Paul saying as he stood there before the Areopagus? He was announcing that God had decided that civilization, the great Greco-Roman civilization, had about run its course. They'd had a good run. They had accomplished great things. God had blessed them. That's why they'd been able to accomplish much. But their time was almost up. That was a pretty gutsy thing for Paul to say, wasn't it? But amazingly, the Athenians let him get away with it. They were interested in what he was saying. In fact, they even invited him to come back so they could continue to converse with him about it. They did it, I suspect, because they knew somewhere deep down that there was actually a lot of truth in what Paul was saying. And this is where I see this incident in Paul's life really speaking to us where we are right now. I realize that in the midst of this pandemic crisis, a lot of people have been focusing on their desire to resume life as it was before all of this started. And I can understand that, of course. In the midst of so much uncertainty, it's only natural to grasp for the last thing that felt normal. And that's how the world was a few months ago. And so if anyone suggests that the way things were a few months ago maybe wasn't so great, and maybe we shouldn't just want to go back to the way things were, people are going to push back against that. Nevertheless, I think that a prophetic word like what Paul said at the Areopagus may be in order. God is the one who allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live. Who are we? Who are we to think that our civilization, our great civilization, which we built up until February of 2020, was going to last forever? Who were we to think that everything would just resume as it was after a brief pause to deal with a pandemic crisis? Everyone assumes that your way of life is going to continue unchanged forever, but everyone who's ever assumed that has been wrong. The future of any civilization is in God's hand. It always has been, and it is foolish to think otherwise. And I know that's a disturbing thought, because it means that the future might have a lot of uncertainty to it. And I don't mean to imply here at all that the whole of Western civilization is about to fall or anything like that. I suspect our civilization's got a bit more resilience than that. Nevertheless, I do suspect that we might see in very short order some enormous changes in the order of our world. It could be, for example, that we may soon see the end of the American empire. I know we're not supposed to call it an empire, but really that's the closest biblical term to the kind of power the United States has exercised in the world. And the Bible's very clear. Empires do not last forever. I suspect that we will see great disruptions in the economic order of this world, because people haven't been able to help but notice just how unessential the billionaires have been to us in this time of crisis, while the essentialness of those who toil at the very bottom of the economy has only been highlighted. Things don't look right. Change may be in order. Now, I don't claim to be a prophet, and my predictions, any predictions I might be completely off base, but I think I might right about one thing. Nothing's just going to go back to the way it was before. We, my friends, are in for some serious change. And this is a kind of change that is pretty unsettling and scary, and that is going to impact all of our lives. But what I think that Paul would say to us was what he was trying to say to the people in Athens. Our comfort, our reassurance is not to be taken from some promise that everything's just going to go back to the way it was. Everything's going to be the same as it was before. Nobody, not even God, is promising you that. Don't take comfort from that idea. Paul would say that our comfort needs to be taken from the Lord our God, in whom we live and move and have our being. Let's pray. Gracious God, these are unsettling times, and we may be in for some great change, and that is going to be difficult to navigate, and it's going to affect all kinds of people's lives. We pray that you would continue to be the God that you are, ruling over the nations, even as you set their times and their limits, that you would be working for grace, for justice, and hope for all, because we recognize that we are in your hands and that it is in you that we live and move and have our being. Blessings upon you on this day.